Donald Trump just signaled he may ignore a Supreme Court order on immigration enforcement, not challenge it, not appeal it, ignore it. This is not a policy dispute. This is a constitutional crisis in slow motion, and most people have no idea what happens next. In the next 20 minutes, I'll show you why this moment is more dangerous than any single immigration case, and why it could reshape executive power for the next 50 years. Here's what happened. The Supreme Court issued a ruling limiting certain types of workplace immigration raids without judicial warrants. Standard separation of powers decision. Court set boundaries, the executive enforces within them. Trump's response wasn't to appeal. It wasn't to argue the legal merits. It was to suggest publicly that he might just keep doing it anyway. His exact words were something like, "We're going to do what we have to do to protect the country, and if some judges don't like it, we'll see." And every president grumbles about court rulings. That's normal. But there's a difference between complaining and signaling defiance. When you say "we'll see," you're not disagreeing with the court. You're questioning whether it has authority over you at all. And that's why this isn't just rhetoric. It's a stress test for the Constitution itself. Let me explain what's actually at stake here. The United States government has 3 branches. You know this: legislative, executive, judicial. The reason we have 3 is so no single person can become a king. The courts exist to interpret law and set limits on executive power. That's not a suggestion. That's the design. When the Supreme Court rules, it's not offering advice. It's setting a constitutional boundary. The president doesn't have to like it, but he has to follow it. Because here's the thing: if the president can choose which rulings to obey, then judicial review means nothing. And if judicial review means nothing, then laws mean nothing. They're just words a president can ignore when convenient. Or when a president decides which laws to follow, you no longer have a president. You have a king. Andrew Jackson ignored the Supreme Court once on Cherokee removal, and we still call it one of the darkest abuses of executive power in American history. Trump isn't proposing a legal argument. He's proposing that argument doesn't matter, that the presidency itself is above judicial review. And if that becomes the new normal, then every protection you think you have under law, every right, every limit on government power, exists only as long as the president feels like respecting it. Now, Trump isn't the first president to push constitutional boundaries. Let's be honest about that. Andrew Jackson defied Worcester, Georgia, and forced a trail of tears. FDR tried to pack the court when it blocked his New Deal programs. Nixon claimed executive privilege to hide Watergate tapes. But here's the difference. Every one of those presidents either backed down or faced consequences. FDR's court-packing plan failed. Congress and the public said no. Nixon's executive privilege claim was rejected by a unanimous Supreme Court, and he resigned rather than defy it. Even Jackson, who committed one of the worst abuses in presidential history, didn't establish a precedent that future presidents could routinely ignore the courts. His defiance was seen as an aberration, not a model. Trump's approach is different. He tests a boundary, as if anyone stops him, then tests further. The travel ban emergency funding for the border wall, ignoring congressional subpoenas. Each time he pushed a little harder. Each time institutions bent a little more. And now we're at the logical endpoint. What if I just don't follow the Supreme Court? This isn't a single bad decision. It's a pattern becoming a system. And the pattern tells you everything you need to know about where this is headed. When Trump defied congressional subpoenas during his first impeachment, the argument was executive privilege protects the president's advisors. When he declared a national emergency to fund the border wall after Congress said no, the argument was the president has emergency powers. When he pressured the Justice Department to investigate his political enemies, the argument was the president oversees federal law enforcement. Every time there was a technical legal argument, and every time the real message was the same. The rules don't apply to me. Now we're at the Supreme Court, the final institutional check, and the message is still the same. The problem isn't that Trump disagrees with this ruling. Presidents disagree with rulings all the time. The problem is that he's signaling he might not comply. And once that line is crossed, there's no institution left to say no. Congress can't enforce a Supreme Court ruling. They can impeach, but we've already seen how that ends. The courts can't enforce their own rulings. They depend on the executive branch to carry them out. So, if the president says no, what happens next? That's the question most people haven't thought through. And it's the question that should terrify you, because the answer is institutional chaos. So, what actually happens if the president ignores a Supreme Court ruling? The answer is institutional chaos, because the entire federal system depends on a basic assumption that everyone agrees the court has final say on constitutional questions. If the president doesn't agree, then why should anyone else? Let's walk through it step by step, because this isn't theoretical. This is the actual mechanism of how democracies break down. Say Trump orders ICE and CBP to keep conducting these raids despite the ruling. Federal agents now have two conflicting orders, one from the court, one from the White House. Some agents follow the court. Some follow Trump. Oh, you now have law enforcement splitting into factions based on loyalty rather than law. Career officials who have been at these agencies for 20 years, people who took an oath to the Constitution, not to a president, are suddenly forced to choose. Do they follow the Supreme Court and risk being fired by political appointees? Do they follow the White House and risk being part of what they know is illegal conduct? Some resign. We've already seen that in this administration. People who didn't want their names attached to policies they believed violated the law. Some comply under protest, documenting everything, hoping someone will hold leadership accountable later. And some just follow the order, either because they agree with it or because they're too afraid to do anything else. But here's the critical point. None of those responses actually resolve the crisis, because the question isn't what individual officials do. The question is structural. Who enforces a Supreme Court ruling if the president says no? Normally, it's the Justice Department. The DOJ is supposed to defend court orders, even against other parts of the executive branch. That's their job. But the DOJ reports to the president. The Attorney General serves at the pleasure of the president. So, if the president tells the DOJ to ignore the court, and the DOJ complies, then there's no enforcement mechanism left. The court can rule, yeah, but it can't make arrests. It can't deploy marshals on its own authority. It can't freeze funding. It depends entirely on the executive branch to carry out its orders. That's the design flaw Trump is exploiting. The courts have authority in theory, but in practice, they need the president's cooperation. And if that cooperation disappears, the separation of powers collapses. Now let's go one level deeper, because this doesn't just affect federal agencies. Governors get involved. Blue state governors say, we're following the Supreme Court's ruling. Federal agents operating in our state must comply with judicial orders. Red state governors say, we back the president. Federal immigration enforcement in our state will continue as directed by the White House. You've just fractured immigration enforcement along state lines. And if that's allowed, what stops governors from ignoring other federal court rulings they don't like? California decides it won't enforce federal gun laws that the Supreme Court upheld. Texas decides it won't recognize federal environmental rulings. Florida ignores voting rights decisions. If the president is above the court, then agencies are above the law, and governors are above agencies. Then sheriffs are above governor. The entire chain of legal authority collapses. This isn't a slippery slope argument. This is how federal systems fracture. We've seen it in other countries. You start with one branch refusing to recognize another's authority. Then regional governments pick sides. Then local enforcement fragments. And suddenly, you don't have one country under one set of laws. You have 50 separate legal systems operating on political loyalty. When I was president, we had intense disagreements with Republican governors on health care, on environmental policy, on education, but we all operated under the same constitutional framework. If a federal court ruled, we followed it, even when we hated the ruling, even when we thought the court got it wrong, because the alternative is chaos, and chaos doesn't favor anyone in the long run. Now let's talk about Congress, because people assume Congress can step in and fix this. They can't. Congress can hold hearings. They can pass resolutions. They can threaten impeachment, but they can't actually enforce a Supreme Court ruling. During Trump's first impeachment, the House issued subpoenas to White House officials. Trump told them not to comply, and they didn't. The House could have held them in contempt. They could have asked the courts to enforce the subpoena. But enforcement would require the executive branch, which was the one refusing to comply. See the problem? The only real power Congress has is impeachment, and we already know how that ends. The House can impeach, but the Senate won't convict if it's controlled by the president's party. So Congress can make noise, but they can't make the president follow the law. And sure, that leaves one option, the ballot box curse. In theory, voters can hold a president accountable for defying the court. In theory, that's the ultimate check on executive power. But that only works if two things are true. First, voters have to care. And the evidence suggests that most voters don't pay close attention to separation of powers dispute. They care about the policy outcome, not the process. If you support stricter immigration enforcement, you might not care that Trump ignored a court ruling to do it. You got the result you wanted. Yay. Second, elections only work as a check if they're free and fair. And if a president is willing to ignore the Supreme Court, what makes you think he'll respect election results he doesn't like? We already saw this in 2020. Trump claimed, without evidence, that the election was stolen. He pressured state officials to overturn results. He encouraged a mob to stop the certification. The only reason that didn't work is because enough Republicans in positions of authority said no. Governors, secretaries of state, judges, even his own vice president. But what happens next time if all those people have been replaced by loyalists who believe the president is above judicial review? If Trump can ignore the Supreme Court on immigration, the next president can ignore it on election law, or voting rights, or anything else that stands between them and power. This is how democracies die now. They should control how pressure one ignored ruling at a time, not in a dramatic coup, not with tanks in the streets, but with a slow, quiet erosion of the mechanisms that keep power in check. The president expands emergency powers, then keeps them after the emergency ends. The president ignores congressional subpoenas, then ignores court rulings, then ignores election results. Each step seems small. Each step has a justification, but the cumulative effect is catastrophic, and the people who live through it don't realize what's happening until it's too late, because it doesn't look like tyranny. It looks like getting things done. It looks like fighting for you. It looks like finally a president who won't let judges stop him until one day you wake up and realize there's no institution left that can say no to executive power. And by then, it's too late to get it back. Now let's think long term, because this isn't just about Trump or it's about what comes after. If Trump successfully ignores a Supreme Court ruling and suffers no consequences, what does that teach the next president? It teaches them that judicial review is optional. If Trump can ignore the court on immigration, the next president can ignore it on healthcare, or gun rights, or voting laws, or abortion, or anything. Both parties will use this weapon. That's the thing people don't realize when they cheer for their side breaking norms. You might support Trump's immigration policy. You might think this particular Supreme Court ruling was wrong, fine, in law, but do you want a future Democratic president to have the same power? Because that's what precedent means. It's not a one-time exception. It's a rule that applies to everyone who comes after. Imagine a progressive president in 2029 decides the Supreme Court got the Second Amendment wrong, says we're going to enforce gun restrictions regardless of what the court says. Public safety is more important. Half the country would lose their minds, and they'd be right too, because that president would be citing Trump's precedent. He ignored the court on immigration. I'm ignoring it on guns. What's the difference? Or imagine that same president decides to ignore a Supreme Court ruling on executive power during a climate emergency, starts nationalizing energy companies, redirecting defense spending, overriding property rights. The planet is dying. The court is standing in the way. I'm doing what I have to do. You see where this goes? Once you accept that a president can ignore judicial review when they think the stakes are high enough, you've destroyed the only neutral arbiter we have. Every president thinks their issue is the most important. Every president thinks the court is wrong when it rules against them. That's not new. What's new is the willingness to say, so I'm just not going to follow the ruling. Right now, the only thing stopping a president from doing that is tradition and political pressure, not law or the situation, not enforcement. You are signatures out here and out I think trying just a shared belief that we don't do that here. Oh, and if we lose that belief, there's no coming back because precedent works both ways. It doesn't just give power to the people you like, it gives power to everyone who comes after. Trump won't be president forever, but the powers he claims will be available to every future president. Progressive, conservative, moderate, extremist, doesn't matter. If the courts can't check executive power, then the presidency becomes an elected dictatorship with a 4-year term. Let me tell you what that looks like in practice. A president wakes up and decides a new policy is urgent, or doesn't matter if it's immigration, climate, healthcare, surveillance, whatever. Congress won't pass it. The president does it by executive order. Issues of new things as portray or the courts strike it down. On with your chair. The president does it anyway. States resist. The president threatens to withhold federal funding or sends federal agents to enforce compliance. The press criticizes. The president attacks them as enemies of the state, threatens their licenses, pressures social media companies to suppress their content. Opposition leaders protest. The president suggests they're unpatriotic, hence they might be investigated, maybe even arrested. None of this happens overnight. It's incremental. Each step has a justification. Each step is framed as necessary to protect the country. But the cumulative effect is that the president becomes the only branch of government that matters. And once that happens, democracy is over, not weakened. Over. Because democracy isn't just about voting. Oh, it's about limitations on power. It's about accountability. It's about institutions that can say no or all. Then you, when those institutions disappear, you're left with something that looks like democracy. You still have elections, parties, debates, but functions like soft authoritarianism. The leader's popularly elected, so it's technically democratic. But once in office, they're effectively unchecked. We've seen this pattern all over the world. Turkey, Hungary, Venezuela, the Philippines. Populist leaders win elections, then systematically dismantle the checks on their power. They don't abolish the courts, they just stack them with loyalists and ignore rulers they don't like. They don't abolish the legislature, they just bypass it with emergency decrees and executive actions. They don't abolish the press, they just delegitimize it, attack it, pressure it into submission. And by the time people realize what's happening, the mechanisms for reversing it are gone. That's the path we're on if Trump successfully defies the Supreme Court, not because Trump is uniquely evil, but because he's establishing a precedent that will outlive him. Future presidents, on both sides, will look at this moment and learn. You can't ignore the courts if you frame it right, if you say the stakes are high enough, if you attack the ruling as activist judges or out of touch elites. And once that becomes normal, every contentious issue turns into a constitutional crisis. Abortion rights. President ignores the court and enforces a nationwide ban. Or a nationwide, regardless of what nine justices. Gun right. President ignores the court and enforces confiscation or unrestricted carry, regardless of judicial review. Voting rights. President ignores the court and changes election procedures, ballot access, ID requirements, whatever they want. There's no limiting principle. Because if the president isn't bound by the Supreme Court, then the president isn't bound by anything except political will. And political will is whatever gets you reelected. This is how democracies by now in Jao makes it a huge issue, not through revolution or through precedent or G Y suits or there's I one ignored nor becomes a new normal. One abused power becomes standard practice. Emergency exception becomes permanent authority. And by the time people realize what they've lost, it's too late to get it back. Because you can't restore institutional authority once it's been destroyed. You can't make people respect the courts again once a president has shown them the courts are optional. Trust is fragile. Power is durable. And right now, we're trading the first for the second. So, let's play this out. What does America actually look like if ignoring the Supreme Court becomes normal? First, legal chaos. Right now, businesses can operate nationally because federal law means the same thing everywhere. A company in California follows the same EPA rules as a company in Texas. A bank in New York follows the same financial regulations as a bank in Florida. But if the president can ignore court rulings and governors follow that example, you no longer have national legal standards. Blue states ignore Supreme Court gun rulings. Red states ignore environmental decisions. Purple states pick and choose based on which party controls the state house. Suddenly, if you're a business trying to operate in multiple states, you have 50 different legal systems, not 50 different implementations of the same law, 50 completely different frameworks, each based on political loyalty rather than judicial interpretation. That's not a functioning country. That's a confederation barely held together. Second, the talent drain. Career officials leave government in droves. Not because they disagree with policy, that's always been part of the job, but because they didn't sign up to implement orders they know are illegal. When I was president, we had plenty of policy disagreements within the administration. That's healthy, but everyone operated within the same legal framework. If you're asking people to defy court orders, you're not asking for policy loyalty. You're asking for personal loyalty above law. The people who stay are the people willing to do that. And over time, the entire federal workforce becomes a loyalty machine rather than a professional civil service. You lose institutional memory. You lose expertise. You lose the people who remember why certain rules exist in the first place. What you're left with is a government run by whoever is willing to do whatever the president wants, regardless of law. Third, international credibility collapses. For decades, America has lectured the world about democracy and rule of law. We've sanctioned countries for ignoring their court. We've pressured authoritarian regimes to respect judicial independence. When China cracks down on Hong Kong, we say rule of law matters. When Russia jails opposition leaders, we say independent courts matter. When Venezuela's Maduro ignores judicial rulings, we call it authoritarian. But if our own president ignores the Supreme Court, we've lost all moral authority. Every dictator in the world will point to Trump and say, "You do it too. You call it something else." And they'll be right. We won't be able to build coalitions around democratic values because we're not demonstrating those values ourselves. Our allies won't trust us to uphold agreements because if we don't respect our own courts, why would we respect international commitments? And our enemies will be emboldened because they'll see that the American system is just as fragile as theirs. It just took the right kind of pressure to break it. Fourth, and most dangerous, the next crisis becomes unsolvable. Imagine a real national emergency, not a manufactured border crisis, but something genuinely catastrophic. A pandemic, or a terrorist attack, a financial collapse, a war. In that moment, you need institutions that can function under stress. You need courts that can adjudicate emergency powers fairly. You need Congress that can pass legislation quickly. You need a federal workforce that can execute policy professionally. But if those institutions have been hollowed out, if courts are ignored, if Congress is sidelined, if career officials have been purged, then you have no capacity to respond effectively. The president tries to act, but half the country doesn't trust that the actions are legal. States refuse to comply. Agencies split into factions. And while everyone is fighting about process, the crisis gets worse. That's what happens when you destroy institutional trust during normal times. You don't have it when you actually need it. Let me bring this back to something simple. Either the Supreme Court can limit executive power, or it can't. Either the president is bound by judicial review, or the president is above it. Both cannot be true at the same time. This isn't about immigration policy. I'm not telling you whether you should support stricter enforcement or more open borders. That's a legitimate debate, and people of good faith can disagree. But that debate has to happen within the law, and the law is decided by courts, not by presidential decree. When I sat in the Oval Office, I didn't agree with every court ruling. Nobody does. The Supreme Court ruled against things I cared deeply about, but I followed those rulings because that's the job, or that's the oath. Not because I was a better person or more virtuous, but because I understood what happens if presidents stop following courts. You don't get your policy wins. You get institutional collapse. And institutional collapse doesn't favor anyone in the long run. Not progressives, not conservatives, not anyone. Because once the rules are gone, power is just about who's willing to go further. And there's always someone willing to go further. Trump is testing whether America still believes the president is bound by law. If the answer is no, if he can ignore the Supreme Court and face no real consequences, then we've answered a much bigger question. We've decided that presidential power has no limits except political will. And if that's the country we're becoming, then every other debate is irrelevant because it doesn't matter what policies you support if there's no mechanism to enforce limits on how those policies are implemented. It doesn't matter what rights you think you have if the president can ignore courts that protect those rights. It doesn't matter what laws Congress passes if the president can simply refuse to follow judicial interpretations of those laws. So here's my question for you, and I want you to think about this seriously. Do you think a president should be able to ignore the Supreme Court? Yes or no? Not in this case. Not if I agree with the policy. Not if the stakes are high enough. As a matter of constitutional principle, should any president, this one or the next, have the power to defy the highest court in the land? If your answer is no, then this moment matters more than any single immigration case, because we're about to find out whether that principle still holds. And if it doesn't, then everything else is just noise.